Hundreds of people up and down this country are still seeking justice. And tonight, we are joined by wrongly convicted postmaster Vipin Patel and his son Varchas. Thank you both for coming on. Let me come to you, Varchas, first. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, this. I think a lot of people can't quite believe that it's been going on for as long as it has been. And I was watching Rishi Sunak talking at the weekend as though they can't understand how they got here. They don't understand why there are 3 different schemes that are paying people compensation. Nobody seems to know anything, really, about what went wrong.
Yeah, the Prime Minister did unfortunately get a couple of things wrong, well, a couple of big things wrong. First and foremost, this wasn't such a historic injustice in the early 90s. In fact, it started from 1999. And I find it astonishing how the Prime Minister can actually get these horrible facts wrong. It begs the question, who's actually advising him?
Yeah. And you wonder whether they actually care enough, don't you? Because we've had one politician after another today and all over the weekend basically washing their hands of it, saying it wasn't their fault. They were advised not to talk to people. They didn't really understand what was going on. They just assumed it was a post office problem. I mean, it really is extraordinary.
It is. And I'm finding through, well, in the past number of days, there is a lot of finger pointing going on. But more evidently, during the post office inquiry, that is exactly what some of the former post office lawyers are doing. It's literally buck passing, and I have no recollection, or I do not recall. Now, if you were part of a team that wrongfully prosecuted somebody, you attended court, surely you can recall those events. So I'm finding right now everyone's kind of pointing fingers at one another, but the true victims over here is the actual victim, like my father, a former sub-postmaster, and hundreds of others, if not thousands, in his shoes, who haven't been compensated. I've just watched Mr. Hollinrake's speech. My MP, Dr. Rupa Haq, raised the question as to why my father has not been offered an interim payment. I have categorically on my Twitter platform and other media outlets have said my father has been refused an interim payment. Yet he's responded to my MP of Acton and Ealing and Acton Central to say Mr. Patel has been offered an interim payment. Now, I wouldn't be putting this case across in the public domain if my dad had actually been offered an interim payment.
No, exactly right. And let me ask your dad, Vipin, I mean, you were convicted of defrauding the post office and I suppose by association, the government, of £75,000, and yet you've still not received anything?
Yes, they charged me with fraud, and because I made a confession because I didn't want to go to prison and other compelling reasons. And also the post office solicitor advised me that if I plead guilty, they will make my life easier. I still haven't received anything. And I have a conviction which is overturned. My conviction was overturned 4 months before the famous Court of Appeal ruling in April 2021. My conviction was overturned in December 2020. Now, post office did not offer any evidence when my conviction was being overturned, and they let my appeal be successful. With no evidence being given, my conviction was quashed. But what the post office is now playing cunningly is on a legal technicality by saying we only let it be quashed because it wasn't in public interest to retry me. That's a bit of a lie, because if a criminal is a criminal, if you need to retry them again, you would retry them again. But the only reason they didn't retry me is because they had no evidence. And in my case, I was with the post office inquiry for a long time, since 2012, since Second Sight started investigations, and I had given them plenty of Horizon-related evidence. And then I had given it to Criminal Cases Review Commission. And then I had given it to GLO solicitors, Freights. And so, I mean, there was plenty of evidence which post office had before my conviction was quashed, but they did a dirty and played cunningly to say, we're not going to retry this again and not offering any evidence. So if you don't offer any evidence and say that I can't be allowed interim payment or compensation is wholly wrong in itself, because not having evidence is, then they shouldn't have charged me in the
Well, of course
first
they
place.
shouldn't. If they didn't have any evidence, then how did it get to that point? Let me bring Brian and Alicia back into this. Brian, I mean, I saw a tweet from you saying that, you know, you've waited since 2009 for the BBC to lead on this story. Yeah. They finally did it today. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, I've done bits and pieces on this story over the years, but I mean, it's incredible that it's taken an ITV drama to sort of propel it really into the sort of public domain.
Yeah, I mean, it is fantastic to see what has happened as a result of that drama. You know, there's no bitterness about that at all. You know, that she's finally giving the victims the profile, and hopefully will give them the outcome that they've been after for so long. But yes, you know, this has been in the public domain for a long time. It's been talked about in select committees. There have been debates in Parliament, typically those sort of debates with one or two people from either side in there in this vast empty House of Commons. There's a small number of MPs and parliamentarians who've been very vocal about this, but it's never broken outside of that. Partly, I think that's because there's been this sort of, it's computers are a bit complicated and boring. Partly it's because the Post Office has quite aggressively behind the scenes been saying to people, this is not true, there is no story here. And because the Post Office were perceived as this trusted organisation, they called themselves Britain's most trusted brand, people listen to them over the victims.
Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting, Alicia, isn't it? Because we've seen sort of politics in action here. I mean, quite a lot of local MPs, as Brian says, were quite vocal. They wrote letters to ministers. You know, we've seen the Ed Davey sort of mealy-mouthed excuses. I heard other politicians talking today about what they should have done maybe but didn't do. Vince Cable was on TalkTV with Julie Hartley-Brewer, sort of basically saying, well, he didn't think that there was much that he could have done. I mean, it's an extraordinary expose, isn't it, of how politics doesn't work in Britain.
It is for sure, and I think it's one of the few cases that has spanned across so many governments that it can't be party political. It started under a Labour government, then went to the coalition under the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, and then for a bit under the Conservatives on their own. So literally no one there can really get away scot-free and say that they had no control over it and they couldn't have contributed. Pat McFadden was the Minister for the Post Office under the Labour government. He says he doesn't recall this issue at the time. He says that the main focus was always on post office closures, and that's what he spent his time focusing on. Ed Davey, we've obviously heard a lot about that today. He's the current leader of the Liberal Democrats. He said that Post Office lied to him and that he would have had no other way of knowing. Obviously, the victims then say, hang on, you just didn't listen to us. You chose to listen to the Post Office rather than the victims. And then we've just had successive governments, successive people who had the power to really step in, try and just rid themselves of this and say, oh, it wasn't me, it was the person before me. And sadly, because it's spanned over such a long period of time, that seems to work at the moment. No one really is getting the full blame for this.
And that seems to be the problem, because no matter what has happened in the past, I mean, they could solve it now. I'm looking at a story in the Times today, came out tonight, saying that a law to quash all the relatively recent Post Office convictions could be done tomorrow if they wanted to do it. But let's have a look at what Rishi Sunak says. He said he would strongly support any decision to consider removing ex-Post Office boss Paula Vennells' CBE. A petition to do so has now topped 1 million signatures, with campaigners calling for justice and compensation for all the victims of the Horizon IT scandal. TalkTV's Ollie Whitfield-Miocic has been to pay a visit to Miss Vennell.
Just behind me is the home of Paula Vennells, the former CEO of the Post Office between 2012 and 2019, right at the time that the Horizons accounting scandal was in full swing. We've come to her large Bedfordshire home here in the countryside to ask her if she will be handing back her CBE. That's because a petition calling for her to be stripped of that gong has garnered more than 1 million signatures so far. However, Paula Vennells isn't at home today, so we won't be getting those answers anytime soon. Instead, We're going to go and ask locals in the nearby former parish where she used to be the vicar whether that's what she should do.
It was a disgrace. For people to take their own lives and everything is absolute thing. She should be bowing her head in shame. She needs to be stripped.
It's the big people getting away with individuals not believing what they say. Not good at all.
It's
It's a disgrace.
disgrace, absolute disgrace. I'm glad the Prime Minister's got hold of it, and let's hope that he does something, you know, for the people before the election.
She should go and be stripped of the. She should have done it before now.
Let's go back to Varchas and his father, Vipin Patel, the victims, two of many victims in this terrible, terrible story. Varchas, let me just ask you, I mean, how has this affected your lives? It's hard to imagine what your answer is going to be, but I mean, this has been going on for a very long time.
I was 23 when father was wrongfully prosecuted. My life literally went upside down. I lost friends. I was at the material time of 2011. On a number of occasions, I was taunted, insulted by a couple of the parish councillors at the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't nice. On one occasion, one of the councillors at the material time said, made fun out of my dad by saying there's a for sale sign outside the shop. Your dad's not going to be able to survive running the shop much longer, because unfortunately, rumors started to spread in the village straight away from dad's suspension on the 8th of December 2011. And dad received some initial support, but there was also a cohort of people literally who wanted my father dead, and they wanted to drive my father out of the village, mum and dad out of the village. They literally made our lives hell. I live between London and Oxford. It was difficult to make friends in London as well. It was difficult for me to even open up to my employer about my father's wrongful conviction. It was only until 2019 did I tell my manager at the time, after about 8-9 years of employment. I took him into a meeting room and I was literally shivering as I was speaking to him, hoping my former employer wouldn't sack me because my father's got a wrongful fraud conviction on him. Life was terrifying.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It really was.
Just dreadful. Vipin, let me just ask you finally. I mean, Paula Vennells has got a CBE. She's disappeared. Nobody's quite sure where she is. Would you like to see her being stripped of that?
I think definitely, but it's in this cohort of people who have been culprits. It's just not Paula Vennells. There's a lot more in there. So we need to find all of them, and they need to be made. They all need to be made accountable, and if they all need to be prosecuted or convicted, so be it, because it is important that ordinary people's lives who are true to their words and serving communities. In my case, it's a rural community, and most of the postmasters were doing the same. And breaking the public trust and stabbing the very people who serve the community, stabbing in the back by the post office, which is an arm of the government, was in itself wholly unjust and unfair. They should have thought better how to handle this situation, because they knew from day one, even before Horizon was rolled out, that it was faulty and shouldn't have been allowed to have happened. And if they did want to roll it out, they should have made fail-safe systems to make sure ordinary people are not punished for some things that was technically wrong.
Absolutely right. Look, Vipin and Varchas, I wish you both the best in the future sort of battle with the Post Office. We're going to try and get to the bottom of it here. We'll do as much as we can at TalkTV.